Here's the premiere video of the new co-host to Boundary Break. Rest assured, I'm not going anywhere. More info at the end of the video, but I'm excited to see what you guys think of this new host. Hope you enjoy.
Hey, what's going on? Welcome back to another episode in the long-running series where we basically take a camera anywhere we want to try and find secrets and discoveries in some of our favorite games. My name is Snipey, and welcome to New Vegas. So we're just going to jump into this right at the end of the game with one of my favorite discoveries of this whole thing. As hopefully most of you know, there's this ending slideshow that presents you the ending that you got, and for most players, that's where the story ends. That's the last thing you see. For those of you more initiated, you may have known that you're actually able to move around in this final room, I believe under special circumstances, but I've seen it done before just in general. The thing about this room is that if you take a closer look at some of the edges, you can see that it's very hastily put together. Obviously, you're not meant to be able to walk around this place, and so the room that they've created is very bare bones and not well structured. But what many of you may not have known, and I didn't discover until filming this episode, if we go behind this wall, there's an NPC reciting the endgame slideshow audio. But the interesting stuff doesn't stop there, because if you go to rob the guy, you can see that his name is Ron the Narrator, which I believe is a nod to Ron Perlman. He does a lot of voiceover for the Fallout games, and it's really weird to see him in this room. But to me, this seems like some developers having fun, or maybe a slight wink at the camera, if you will. So now that we've seen what the developers hide outside the bounds at the end of the game, let's go back to the beginning and see what we can find there. And Doc Mitchell's house is actually a great area to explore to check out some of the developer tricks that they use across the entire game. Starting off small, there's these holes in the wall, sort of all over the place. The way that they actually work is they're comprised of multiple layers of geometry. You have the wall in the front, you have the sort of wooden beam in between, and then you have this back wood layer with wiring sort of across it. It's actually this really large square, like way larger than it needs to be. And that's because one of the things that the developers use so often in these kinds of games are pre-made assets that make environment building a lot easier. So one of the things in Fallout New Vegas is that if you're ever in a building, there is no exterior. There is nothing outside. It is just void. So the way that they sort of give off the illusion that there is stuff outside, in most cases, is actually really weird. So what they have in this instance in Doc Mitchell's house is they have this large texture of a color, and then to give the illusion that it's this light that's super bright outside that you can't really make out any details, they have some rays of light coming through the window as well. But the main thing with that is if we go to this window in particular, you can see that they didn't quite line the effect up properly. Looks kind of goofy. Now, because the player is not ever meant to go into the void, the developers often will hide stuff or leave stuff out in this empty space, whether that's because they forget or they're kind of essential pieces of how the game functions. But in this case, if you've ever been curious as to what's beyond the blue door, I believe you'll be disappointed because it's just this really large plank. And not to rain on anybody's parade here, but the plank seems to be quite useless. You can't see it from inside. There's no interaction with it. I think the only reason that it would still be here is if the developers used it as reference, as the origin of this map, or they forgot about it. I mean, it's a plank. But one thing that they didn't forget about is this note that's sort of just above this hallway. And if we interact with it, you can actually see that it is the hardcore mode prompt pop-up. So when you go to talk to Doc Mitchell as you leave, this will pop up asking you if you want to enable hardcore mode. And if you're me, you press no. But the main thing is that this prompt has to come from somewhere. And so they've stored it in this note that's just outside the bounds. And one of its quirks is that you can't actually interact with it once you've accepted that dialog box. So once you've selected one of these options, it lies dormant, waiting for the next new game. By the way, Doc Mitchell's note is not the only interactable object that is hidden above the ceiling. If we take a look at this building in Prim, for example, you can see that there's an elevator button just floating there. And while it would have been cool enough to just sort of stop there, if we go to push the button, we can try to fix the elevator. The only problem is when you try to fix the elevator, nothing happens. And you can't use whatever elevator that this button is trying to reference. Though it's possible that this is a leftover of the elevator that's in the floor above. If you're familiar with the other Fallout games or Skyrim, you'll know that the developers often hide stashes underneath maps where characters have maybe like a store or some sort of personal inventory that they need restocked at any given point. And for Fallout New Vegas, that's no different. And in this instance, there's this card game called Caravan that you can play, and because the bets have to come from somewhere because they're actual caps that go to and fro, they're actually stored outside the bounds in these 3 small chests. And speaking of chests, in the Novak gas station, we have a problem. And that problem is, I don't know what these are for. Under basically every apartment building, there's these footlockers that are underneath the buildings. And every time I check them, they're always empty. But strangely enough, that's not the only thing wrong with the Novak gas station, because in this apartment right by the stairs, if you go in and then take the camera back out the door you just came in, you'll see that there's actually a duplicate door. If we interact with this door, it teleports us into the middle of the desert, really far away from Novak. From what I know, this isn't used in any quest. There's no reason for this door to really bring you here, and so I believe this is actually cut content. There's actually a lot of unused content in Fallout New Vegas, none of which is readily accessible to the player. In that same building with the elevator button, if we take a look at the upper floor, there's actually an entire hallway section that's removed, full of different rooms and doors that don't really lead anywhere. Once again, this is possible because the developers reuse assets, and this could possibly be some sort of interior prefab that they decided to shorten the length of in this building. And if we take a look inside Vault 21, we can see a similar story. There's this door in the hallway that you can't normally go through, but if we take a camera inside, there's actually this really long stretch of interior that has full collision and modeling. Though at the point where the hallways diverge, they do go into nowhere. Throughout the game, interiors tend to be a really great source of out-of-bounds material. In this room, for instance, if we take the camera below the floor, you can see that there is a light attached to the bottom of the floor, you know, in the wrong spot. And this, to me, seems like maybe a leftover asset where they originally intended for the lights to be turned inside that room, maybe just that square of that room in particular. But along the way, they decided that they wanted the light turned the other way, and so we have a remnant of the light turned the wrong way in the floor. And developers don't just hide stuff inside either. Now, if we take a close look at my position on the map here, and then go through the floor like a normal person, you'll see that there's an unused rock asset in this area. Now, try as I might, I couldn't find the exact use of this rock elsewhere in the game, though I'm sure if you look hard enough, there is an instance of it, but it's just really fun to see when developers leave geometry below where you can really even see it. And honestly, that opens me up to talk about some of my favorite weirdness that I found, and that's if in any outside area you take the camera below the floor you're standing on, you'll see that there's the high level of detail mesh on top, and always below there's the low level of detail mesh rendered alongside you the entire way. I don't know how many resources this is particularly taking up, but it's one of those elements of Fallout jank that I feel really sell the experience. One of the things that I love about New Vegas is that off in the distance there's always some sort of landmark that you can see. One of the first ones in general being this NCR statue. And if we take our camera super far away from the player, we can see how this is pulled off with low poly meshes. And because the player is never meant to see it from this distance, they don't have to put that much effort into making it anything other than kind of the silhouette. But one interesting thing, they kept the poles. Honestly, a little shocked to see them there. And you know what? It's that time of the episode. We get to talk about low poly birds. And this bird model is actually really close to the one that they use in Fallout 3. Almost exactly the same, actually. It's kind of this weird paper plane shape. By the way, to compare the two, here's a look at the high poly bird. Notice the extra detail and the lack of paper plane. And let's take this opportunity to look a little bit closer at some of the character and creature models that we'll see throughout the rest of the game. First, let's take a look at the player character. You, or in this case, me. If we take the camera in for a closer look, we can see a lot of the details in the skin, around the neck and the hands. And these textures actually have a lot of detail to them. One of the techniques at play here is they have a close-up image of real human skin detail that they've overlaid on top of this model. And in the case of the hands, it can lead to an appearance of high detail. Though admittedly, the hands do look kinda dated and gross. But it looks like the top half of the body got all of the love, because these legs are something else. And do not get me started on the texture that they've overlaid on this foot block. And along that line, there's actually a quirk with how Fallout New Vegas reuses Fallout 3 assets. Like with the Super Mutant model, where in order for them to wear these sort of flip-flops, they actually have a foot rendered outside their normal foot. Taking the camera inside reveals that it's sort of similar to the player character's foot, where it's this really blocky shape. Next up, we have a fairly standard-looking wolf, but actually there's a lot to see here. And on this model in particular, there seems to be a lot of issues with transparency at the seams, and we can see that replicated in a couple places on the model, namely the chest and one of the back legs. But real quick, let's take a look at the eyes. Moving the camera in on the right eye, you can see that it's fairly standard, though it is interesting to note that the eye is almost fully rendered. But if we take a closer look at the left eye, you can see something a little strange. And that's because there's two eyes occupying this single socket, with one being really big and one being really small. And they actually overlay each other on the outside of the model too. One of the earlier enemies you encounter in Fallout New Vegas are these giant mantises. And one detail that I want to take a closer look at, because you kind of don't really see it ever, they have this really cool idle animation where they strike a pose. And you can see in this animation, and a lot of their other animations, is that they have wings. And if we take a closer look in their abdomen here, which yes, is pulsating at all times, you can see that the wings are always fully rendered. Anyway, here's some detail shots of the Cazador. You can see that there's a lot of cool effects done on the textures to give them sort of this glossy, insect-like appearance. And it's really gross! And since guns are such a big part of the Fallout experience, considering most of the time you have one in your hands, I want to take this time to look at some of the interesting things with how they modeled the weapons. And every weapon is modeled slightly differently. If we take a look at the varmint rifle, which you get right at the start of the game, one interesting thing to note is while on the outside it looks quite normal, if we take a look at the magazine, you can see that there is a bullet fully modeled. Though what's interesting about it is that instead of having a separate bullet texture, it actually has what appears to be the texture map of the gun itself. On the casing, you can see some of the metal parts of the gun, but taking a look at the bullet itself reveals that it has the wooden texture from the stock. And I have a question for you. Can you see the bullet in this hunting rifle? No? Here, I'll give you a hint. It's right here. Yes, instead of having the same technology used for the varmint rifle, it's a flat texture on top of the magazine. And what's weirder still is that even though these two guns use different forms of bullets for their magazines, a lot of the weapons in the game don't even render the bullets in general. But there's one gun where you can see all the bullets, and an extra one. On this 357 revolver, taking a look inside the cylinder, you can see that there's the 6 bullets that the gun normally fires around in a circle, and then in the center we have this extra bullet, but this one fully modeled. And we actually know why this bullet exists. When you're reloading the 357, every new bullet you put in is this middle bullet, which teleports in and out of the gun. Now, if you've played New Vegas at all, you're probably familiar with the quest line where some ghouls want to go to space. And there's a whole lot of weird stuff about this place. In the dome where the rockets are later launched from, if we take the camera inside even before we've done any part of the quest, you can see that the rockets are always loaded beneath the floor. And if we go inside the facility, there's some other things that we can see too. Like one of these doors, for example, which are made up of these parallel squares that occupy the same space. But when they come up from the ground, they're separated from their height, which combines to create the door. And if you've ever wanted to do a little boundary breaking yourself without having to use a camera, in this room that overlooks the rockets, if you get close enough to the window and crouch, you can see that the developers didn't render this wall high enough for you to not be able to see out of the map. Taking the camera inside the chamber and then looking back towards the window reveals that the wall also isn't fully displayed. And if you were ever wondering if the ghouls made it to their destination, I have some bad news for you. If we take the camera outside of this viewport that the player would normally see this from, the rockets don't actually make it that far before they're teleported back to their original position underneath the dome. Taking the camera back through this door in the viewport reveals another secret. And if you see this computer monitor, you may be thinking, well, what's that for? And funnily enough, if we go to interact with it, you can see that it's an NPC that you can talk to, and it gives you default dialogue.
What do you need?
But what's interesting to note is that this monitor is named Launch Music. This is where the music actually plays from when the launch sequence is initiated. And we can see this trick used elsewhere if we go into the New Vegas Strip. Under the Lucky 38, we can see another computer, but this one is named Tops Radio. Before we fully head into the New Vegas Strip, though, I want to take a look at these gardening tents just outside. And what's weird about these is not so obvious at first, since for the player, once you go inside, there's not a whole lot to do. You can walk around on the interior, and then you can leave out the door you came in, or the door on the other side, and that puts you out on the other side of the tent. But taking full advantage of our ability to leave the bounds, and moving the camera out of these tents, you can see that they're actually all interwoven and connected in a really strange way. And yes, the doors are fully functional. And it's weird enough in general that all these areas are interconnected. What's stranger still is that the environment around these tents actually extends for quite a while. And by quite a while, I mean I auto-walked for over 40 minutes and I didn't find the edge. I sped up my speed to 10,000%, kept walking, and eventually just reloaded me back in the center of the map. So I don't really know how far it goes, but no matter which direction you go, there's always this single chunk of floor that is constantly underneath you. Kinda crazy. And because I think it's a little interesting, I just want to take a moment of appreciation for this sign in the middle of nowhere that simply just says, duh, which, looking a bit closer, reveals that the text is actually floating off of the sign. The New Vegas Strip is probably the most important area of the game, and it's only fitting that it has some of the weirdest stuff going on. First things first, and this is similar to the tents outside, every area in the Strip is actually fully rendered when you're outside. Though not all of the doors work. Trust me, I've tried. Here's another close look at reused assets, with a lot of these smaller building assets that actually make up this larger area. They're kind of these smaller, squared-off shapes that are copy-pasted to create the look of larger buildings. As for large buildings, without further ado, we have the largest one in the game, the Lucky 38 Tower, which, if you were wondering, the low level of detail model is rendered on all sides, but the high detail model is actually only rendered in the front where the player can see it. Taking the camera outside of the tower shows that both floors are actually loaded in at the same time. And for some reason at ground level, there's a fully modeled, albeit low poly landscape, even in areas that the player can't see. And in case you saw that door, worry not, because we can lockpick it, though we can't open it or do anything with it, and it doesn't go anywhere. And while we're on the topic of the Lucky 38, this is actually a great opportunity to look at one of the viewer requests, which was to take a closer look at what the lab looks like. And looking around, you can see that there's a lot of nonsense geometry. And considering that this room is almost completely pitch black, a lot of this stuff is actually unseeable by the player. And to the one guy who was wondering where the boomers fire their rockets from, turns out the rockets come from thin air, right behind that control tower. And here's a closer look at that artillery shell that the boomers fire. The colors on this shell are interesting too. There's the red hot tip and the green color on the side. The other side is mostly a black color. It's interesting that this is textured at all because the player can barely ever see this, but it might be reusing another projectile from a different weapon. And in one of the quest lines for the boomers, there's this plane that's crashed in the bottom of a lake, and you attach some buoys to the bottom of the wings to get it to float. But what you may not have noticed is that where the plane is crashed and where it comes out of the water are actually two completely different spots. Now, it makes sense that the plane comes up where it does, because that's where the player has to stand, but in that case, why not just put the plane there to begin with? Seems like a bit of a strange choice. And for those of you who wanted to know what's underneath the dam, I have a treat for you. On this side of the dam, going underneath reveals a vertibird, the very same vertibird that's used at the end of the game during the dam fight, if you've completed the Enclave quest and asked them to help you, which I did. And that Enclave quest actually leads to one of my favorite things that I found, and this was totally on accident. In every area of the game that I found, except for this one, the void has been this sort of tan color. And taking the camera out of this vault, and specifically this room is where I found it, you'll see that not only is this void a light blue, this room, for some reason, is encased in a black cube. And so far, the only time I've ever seen a black cube used in this game is to give the illusion of interiors on buildings with broken windows. So I don't know why this is here, but it's really cool. And it's just like a cherry on top. The rest of this area is loaded in too, with the doors just teleporting you between the rooms. And also the entire thing is full of black rectangles. And to tie this video off, here is a zoom out of the entire map.
So I'm going to give the outro over to Snipey in 2 seconds. I just wanted to say, I hope you guys enjoyed his first video. And the plan here is that we're going to be alternating our uploads so that we hit every single week, with the goal being that we're going to hit every single Friday. So definitely check back on the channel every single Friday to see if we've uploaded something. I think Snipey's great, but I'm going to be looking at all of your comments to see what you guys are saying. I guarantee that if there's something off, we can definitely work it out. But I think a lot of us can admit the dude's got a great personality and a voice of gold. But anyways, let's pass it off to Snipey.
Hi. I don't really know what to say here, but I really hope you enjoyed watching my first video. I know I really enjoyed making it, and I'm super thankful to She Says for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to the next few years. As for this video, again, please let me know how I did, what you guys think I need to change. This means more to me than words. Anyway, that's all for me. Hope you guys have a fantastic day, whatever day you watch this. I will catch you guys in the next one. See ya.